Out of the Fiery Furnace is brought to you by a company that makes aluminum for transportation, construction, and manufacturers of consumer products all around your house. Commonwealth Aluminum.
The Bosphorus at Istanbul. This is one of the most celebrated of all the many shores of the ancient world, and perhaps its most vivid frontier, the one which separates Europe from Asia at the Golden Horn. It is part of the geography of one of the most brilliant and evocative legends of prehistory, the story of the quest for the Golden Fleece. What was the impulse which drove Jason and the Argonauts, that famous company of some of the most gallant heroes of ancient Greece, to pass this way and on to what were then the secret ends of the earth to retrieve the Golden Fleece? The legend is an allegory for all that is superior and the conquest of the impossible. But when it's undressed and it's stripped of its heroic mantle and its fabulous detail, the story of the quest for the Golden Fleece describes an expedition some 1,200 years BC, out beyond the Golden Horn and over the Euxine Sea to present-day Armenia, to seize the source of a shining prize. There, the laborious process of washing river sands through the fleece of sheep left clinging to the oily fibers the first metal to attract the devoted attention of man, and which has remained his obsession for millennia. Immortal, incorruptible gold. Gold was the spur which drove men and nations in a surge of expansion after civilization had emerged from the Dark Ages in Europe. Gold, as much as curiosity, drew the explorers and conquistadors to cross unknown oceans to the New World. And it was gold, finally, which in the 19th century set off the most feverish migrations in history and helped establish new nations in the Southern Hemisphere. The collapse of the Pax Romana, the stability of the Roman peace, began on the periphery of the great empire. The trade routes between the Western world and the East began to wither. Order and safe conduct gave way. But during those centuries when darkness descended across the classical Mediterranean civilizations, ideas and technologies survived and grew in India and China. Not until the West began to recover from its protracted atrophy did the camel trains renew the old and vital pathways between East and West. That reunion of creative ingenuity would itself give rise to a new dominance whose horizons would be worldwide. The Europe that slowly recovered from the long night of the Dark Ages saw the beginnings of a new form of society, in which for the first time perhaps the common man might hope to share the rewards of labor, luck, and material progress. It was perhaps the first kind of society to foreshadow the aspirations of our own time. In towns like Goslar, in the Harz Mountains of West Germany, enterprise and civic virtue have been invested since medieval times in buildings that have lasted the best part of 1,000 years already. The source of Goslar's long prosperity is buried deep inside the mountain behind the town, called the Rammelsberg. Goslar is one of the oldest mining towns in the world. The Rammelsberg mine has been in continuous operation for just over 1,000 years. Over the 10 centuries which have followed the first strike of silver in 983, the mine has eaten out the heart of the mountain. To vanquish that ancient enemy of mining, water, the most remarkable system of drainage tunnels has been cut over the course of some 800 years. The deepest drain inside the Rammelsberg is a tunnel nearly 3 kilometers long. It took 100 years to finish. In mining, old workings are so often devoured by new ones that it's unusual for the methods or machinery of one period of mining to survive the onslaught of the next. But down below in the Rammelsberg mine, some of the old mining architecture is still visible. These huge water wheels, they're 30 feet in diameter, are the mining machinery of 150 years ago. And they give just a hint of the expanding scale and dimension of mining with which we're more familiar in our own time. Outside the mountain, the miners created a lake, and from that they cut a tunnel down into the mine, the tunnel I've just walked through. Down the tunnel came the water to turn the wheel. And when it turned, it operated on either side of it a system of long wooden beams and shafts, which were in turn connected to the pumps far below. That's what drained the mine and made deep mining possible. These water wheels were the successors of something far less likable, and which were in use in this mine at Rammelsberg until the 17th century. That bondage of the ancient miner, which endures into the language of our own day as a synonym for arduous, hard labor, the human muscle power of the treadmill. As the miners overcame the problem of water, then, so it was said, they swam in silver. These wheels were the hidden but indispensable factor in a remarkable period of European history. The output of silver from the Rammelsberg helped to fuel the Renaissance and finance the conquest by the Europeans and colonization of the world. And the mine owners became the creditors of the courts and princes of Europe. Just as the fall of the Roman Empire was preceded, as we know, by a decline in its supply of metals, so too did the rise of Europe from the Dark Ages and the Renaissance begin with the discovery and development of new mines in Europe. The new confidence and optimism which accompanied the influx of metals from Goslar into the economies of all the medieval states of Europe spread into all aspects of life. Henry VIII of England was one monarch who was granted loans by the new class of mining entrepreneurs that flourished here. And wealth from the Rammelsberg mine became part of the patronage of the arts in Europe. This room in Goslaw's Town Hall, built in the early 16th century, is part of the wealth which stayed behind in Goslar and shows the spreading of the influence of the Renaissance into Northern Europe, assisted by silver from Ramelsberg. The new studies of anatomy and the working out of the mathematics of perspective begin to show in the paintings that coming mastery of proportion and naturalness of form, which marked the onset of a surge of activity, political, intellectual, economic, and religious in Europe, to which the Ramelsberg mine gave a powerful impetus.
The prosperity which began to infuse Western Europe not only created new classes of artisans and craftsmen and the emerging middle classes, it gave opportunities for fertile minds to expand and stretch. Residual memories of forgotten technologies from both East and West were revived. Western Europe was poised for the fresh advances which would reshape the world.
Few things in history have proved more reviving to the spirits of just men long oppressed than the might of the printed word. The capacity to store knowledge, to disseminate it widely, generously, rapidly to others, led to that immense spread of learning and literacy which made printing one of the greatest concepts of civilized man. The elements which produced that unique advance were known and available before the discovery was made. They were tributaries of knowledge flowing through many places. But here, in Mainz, in Germany, they converged in the mind of one man. In the 15th century, a goldsmith with an alert intelligence and the vital coincidence of personal interests had a perception so acute that the solution he proposed to an age-old problem would not have to be changed for a further 500 years. That goldsmith was Johannes Gutenberg, the master of Mainz.
In Gutenberg's Europe, by the Middle Ages, there were, of course, books of exquisite detail and beauty. But they were not for every man. Because of the nature of the processes, inscribed and painted by hand on sheets of split animal skins, vellum or parchment, they could only be accessible to few. Before books could become more widely available, two things were necessary: a cheaper material to print on, and a faster way of reproducing a page of text or illustration. Both solutions came from the Chinese. The Chinese discovered how to treat different kinds of plant fibers so that when shredded, mixed with water, and allowed to settle on a fine screen, they would, when dry, form a perfect surface on which to write or draw. That knowledge of the art of papermaking seems to have reached Europe in the 8th century AD. While they were inventing paper, the Chinese were also beginning to print from characters carved in wood. There's some evidence that by the 15th century, metal characters were being used for printing in Korea, although the characters themselves have not been found. However, the Eastern civilizations lost their way when it came to the liberating marriage of metal and print. It was Gutenberg in Europe who solved the problem of making letters that wouldn't easily wear out and making them cheaply. He did it by using a technique of metallurgy that had been known and practiced for thousands of years, casting. The Gutenberg method was to cut a steel die of each letter and with it punch an impression into a small block of copper. This was fitted into a clamp to make a mold. For his type, he devised a mixture of lead, tin, and antimony, which had a very low melting point, about 240 degrees Celsius. When filled with his type metal, it produced a letter on top of a stem, and as many identical copies as were wanted. Gutenberg's achievement was comprehensive. He worked out a complete system of printing. He kept each letter in a separate hole in his typecase and assembled them in a stick to make a complete line. If all this looks familiar, it is, because Gutenberg's system is still being used in printing shops all around the world. To get a firm, even impression on his page of type, Gutenberg adapted a device known since Roman times, the wine press. For the first time, there was a means of disseminating knowledge on an almost universal scale. It became an overwhelmingly important factor in the evolution of present society. At a stroke, all human knowledge, imagination, folly, and achievement could be drawn upon. The first book that Gutenberg chose to print was the Bible. For his first typeface, he copied the script used by the monks of Mainz. It took him 3 years, from 1452 to 1455, to produce about 200 complete copies.
48 copies of the Gutenberg Bible are known to survive, including these 3 superb specimens in the vaults of the Gutenberg Museum in Mainz. What is astonishing about this inspired achievement, the first work to be printed with a movable metal type, is that each reproduction is as perfect and immaculate as any other. Gutenberg's Bible was the first and last masterpiece of a man who soon lost everything in debts and lawsuits, and who died destitute, blind, and forgotten. But history attributes to Johannes Gutenberg a prophetic insight. With my 26 soldiers of lead, he said, I shall conquer the world. How right he was. They marched down all the roads of Europe and almost all the roads on earth.
With the rapid spread of printing, a great interchange of information began, particularly in technology. The first comprehensive book on mining by Agricola was published in 1556. Called De Re Metallica, on the subject of metals, it not only became the miner's Bible for the next 200 years, it underlined the important part played in the ascendance of Europe by the flood of silver and other metals from the mines of Saxony and Bohemia. Silver breathed new life into trade and commerce. Precious metals aroused the new preoccupation of the European powers. The conquest of distant regions of the world was brought within reach by critical improvements in the design of ships and sails. The expansion of the influence of Europe became inseparable from the thrust after gold and silver that alloyed wealth with power. the most celebrated search launched by the Western world for the rumored riches that lay beyond the setting sun began here. It's the monastery of La Rábida on the flat estuary of the Rio Tinto near Cadiz in Spain.
Explorers need visions, as lesser men need food, and Christopher Columbus certainly had his. It was based on Marco Polo's description of China as a country rich in gold and silver, in all kinds of precious stones and spices, and as he put it, things not reaching our country at present. And Columbus was seized with an idea, talked about in the seaports of Europe, that a ship sailing westwards would eventually come to India and China. But he had no practical support for his dream of putting such a voyage into effect until he came here to this little monastery at La Rábida on the port of Huelva in Spain with his son Diego in 1485.
Columbus was welcomed here by Father Antonio de Marquena, the friar. Marquena was an amateur astronomer, and here he indulged and inspired Columbus's obsessive determination. The monastery was Columbus's main support and encouragement during the 7 years it took for the expedition to become a reality. And it was here, in July 1492, that Columbus made his final plans with the monks and the captains of his 3 ships. Columbus and his companions spent some weeks at the monastery, dining in this room with the monks and preparing themselves for the vast unknown. This little room in the monastery is now known as the Bethlehem of the Americas. Columbus himself walked the corridors and courtyards, convinced, as he wrote later to his patrons, that neither reason nor mathematics nor maps would be of any use to him in his enterprise. And here in this chapel, Columbus made his final prayer, allied with an important request, asking, as he later said, for the Lord to show him where gold is born.
On the 3rd of August, 1492, Columbus's men filled their water casks from this well, and the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Nina set sail down the Rio Tinto. In the scale and dimension of its consequences, and because it changed so many things for so many people, it is perhaps the most important journey man has made. One senses that it was time for the Europeans to make that journey. They had the ships, they had the men, they had the money too. It was time to go. It was the lure of gold which led to the discovery of the New World, where Spain would mine with the sword, as Columbus was followed by the conquistadores.
The conquistadors believed themselves to be the chosen instruments of Almighty God. Their overwhelming statements in the New World still stand to affirm it. In one of them, the great cathedral in Lima, the conquistadors' capital in Peru, lies the body of Francisco Pizarro, the conqueror of the Incas.
The terror of the unknown seas had been dispelled for them by Columbus's voyages. And with that knowledge and their own ruthless audacity, they were twice armed. Those blood-soaked pyramids of the Aztecs of Mexico, with their human sacrifices, can have done little to diminish the conquistadors' conviction that they were men with a mandate to enforce righteousness, as well as to pursue riches by the sword. The conquistadors came from the harsh and fertile heartland of Spain in its 16th century poverty. Their astonishment by the New World was captured by Keats in an imperishable verse, that wild surmise with which Cortes and all his men looked at each other, silent upon a peak in Darien. Before them was the prospect of riches which outshone any in the legendary past. And today we can have only glimpses of that magnificent display which fermented in the conquistadors' minds.
As they marched up the high valleys of Peru, the conquistadors ransacked the Inca Empire in one of history's more tragic conquests. They harvested gold. One massive prize came in the form of ransom for the captured Inca king, Atahualpa. And when it was paid, they killed him. The end for the Incas came in Cusco, their capital, which Pizarro and his men entered in 1533. This finally reduced the Inca civilization, whereupon the Spaniards melted down into ingots the treasure of many centuries, the greatest accumulation of gold ever seen. The conquistadors also earned retribution. In the years that followed, they fought among themselves. Pizarro himself was, in the end, assassinated. But on the rubble of the great stone walls and palaces of the Incas, Spain raised up the might and majesty of its Christian empire. The shattered remnants of the Incas retreated to their fastnesses in the mountains. Some, like Machu Picchu, were so inaccessible that the Spaniards never found them. This fantastic human roost, high in the thin air of the Andes, was lost and forgotten. Machu Picchu lay undiscovered for nearly 400 years. It was not until 1911 that the American explorer Hiram Bingham found it beneath a mantle of ferns and creepers. It's one of the most spectacular of the Incas' monuments and a memorial to the most devastating treasure hunt in all history.
Nothing was found, nothing has been found at Machu Picchu to suggest conclusively what happened to it. But this stone ark, if that is what it was, stranded on its self-chosen Ararat high in the Andes, failed to secure the survival of the Incas. Machu Picchu is a vestigial remnant of the once savage splendors of the Inca nation. Gold is immutable. All the gold that has ever been processed by man still exists somewhere. Gold follows only success in the rise and fall of nations. And because of that, it's not inconceivable that Inca gold from the Andes has made an even longer journey than that original one to Spain. Some of it may have been to the moon, on the visors of those latter-day conquistadors, the Apollo astronauts.
its initial plunder and then its mines in the New World, Spain was raised to the heights of European power. As a direct consequence, the existing supply of money in Europe was doubled in 100 years and quadrupled in 2. And gold was still the most desired and widely sought mineral in the Earth's crust.
But Machu Picchu is not just an epitaph for the Incas. We may conveniently use it to date a gradual loss of that former total authority of gold itself. For whatever the price still attaching to precious metals, there came a time when the growth and expansion, the wealth of nations, no longer seemed to be dependent on the amount of gold they had. And by the 18th century, the arguments about whether gold was a more powerful sinew than steel had had their day. The age of piracy was over. A new kind of human endeavor was taking place in a new land, America. In contrast to that single-minded preoccupation with gold which animated the Spanish conquest of the Americas, America itself was a dream of riches more diverse and generous. The gold on the summits of American institutions, like the splendid state capital of California in Sacramento, capped an ideal, the ideal of an individual democracy, not the authority of an absolute monarchy. And it stood for commonwealth as well as for self-enrichment. And the commonwealth was the vision which inspired a recurring deluge of immigration from the old world. But the old Adam lay in waiting to be aroused in the common citizen, no less than in the conquistador. On January the 24th, 1848, a little stone was picked up, lying loose in the gravel, which had come from the bed of the American River here near Sacramento. The little stone, when set in motion, caused a human avalanche. We know it as the gold rush. That first revelation to the common citizen that there might be a fortune literally lying at his feet was made manifest at a timber mill along the banks of the American River, Sutter's Mill. This is a replica of Sutter's Mill, kept by California as a national monument and moved back a bit from the river today so it can all be seen more clearly. Gold was found in the tail race of Sutter's Mill, washed down into it by the sluices from the American River, which took water to the wheel. When the news of those first nuggets spread, and the rumors of richness with them, there was a uniform response, an immediate clamor, and a human stampede of mostly unwise men from the East. A rush of 100,000 kissed the girls goodbye and came here to the diggings, then half a continent away from the settled areas of the United States. They surged across the prairies in that breathless exodus by wagon train, on horses, pushing wheelbarrows. And as they came, they speeded up the settling of the continent, and they opened up the West. The whole thing lasted only about 5 years, by which time the alluvial gold, and with it, opportunities for an individual scavenger had gone, and the big mining companies took over. Before the gold diggers set out, bound for Sacramento as they sang with the washbowl on my knee, There were 14,000 people in all of California, and by the time they left, there were 500,000. In 1850, somewhere near the height of the California gold rush, California became the 31st state of the Union. Upon what started here at Sutter's Mill, the Americans built a pyramid of credit and capital. In the process of completing that ironic cycle, which reburies most of it in American soil at Fort Knox, it was gold flowing into circulation which helped to build the American economy, the like of which had never been seen before. The California gold rush was the first of those international hunts which proved to be the greatest migration in the mass since the Crusades, and they spread out like shock waves over the next 60 years.
Among those who came to California from Australia was Edward Hargreaves. He too went to American River, where he spent a barren, unlucky year, after which he was back in Australia, but intrigued, he said later, by the resemblance Californian countryside bore to New South Wales. In February 1851, Hargreaves borrowed a horse and rode inland from Sydney over the Blue Mountains, announcing his certainty of finding payable gold where others had failed. These are the hills near Bathurst, which he said reminded him of California. In fact, Hargreaves was going on more than simply topographical coincidence. Like others, he knew that nuggets of gold had been found near these watercourses in the valley of the Macquarie River. However, Edward Hargreaves had one great advantage over those who had searched before him. He had brought back from California the famous wash bowl of the 49ers, then quite unknown in Australia. Nonetheless, even he must have got a shock to see in the very first panful of gravel he washed the unmistakable flecks of gold. This is the watercourse which Hargreaves followed when, riding his borrowed horse, he came here to Lewis Ponds Creek, just before it runs into Summerhill Creek, in February 1851.
Hargreaves was born in England. He was a giant of a man. He weighed 18 stone, and he was a suitably large and even egregious figure for the stupendous event which he was about to set in motion. He came here the man from Sacramento, and the carrier of perhaps the most famous contagion of the last century, gold fever. All in all, this now looks pretty much the same as it must have done to him, with one exception: there's more water in the creek today. 1851 was a year of drought in Australia. Wool prices were badly depressed, the boom in land sales had slumped, and things in general looked poor for the scattered settlers who were still clearing their lands. And so there can't be much doubt that they and the colony as a whole were in the mood and looking for some kind of deliverance. And Hargreaves was not slow to sense that. Hargreaves plainly had the kind of personality which was capable of exciting and stimulating the curiosity of others. And it was about here, we know the spot almost exactly, that like Joan of Arc, claiming to hear the voices, he announced that he felt surrounded by gold. And to Hargreaves' own and Australia's vast good fortune, his prophecies turned out, based upon citing a few scanty specks of it, to be true, and true beyond all reasonable imaginings. Within 3 months, by May 1851, the governor of the colony, Fitzroy, was sending urgent dispatches home to the colonial secretary in London, reporting the very great excitement which is engrossing and unhinging the minds of all classes in the community. Hargreaves quickly passed into history as Australia's principal benefactor in the discovery of payable gold. It was a claim which was not sustained subsequently by the inquiries or the historians, except in one respect. It was undoubtedly Hargreaves who single-handed engineered the great Australian gold rush. And it began here.
The rush that Hargreaves triggered in New South Wales was almost immediately overshadowed by the fever that followed the discovery of gold in Victoria, later in 1851. The rush to the rich diggings at Ballarat and Bendigo almost brought the whole country to a standstill. People everywhere dropped everything. The overseas fortune seekers set sail. The population of Victoria doubled in a year, Australia's trebled in a decade. But for every man who struck it rich on the gold fields, there were, of course, thousands who failed, and they were forced to turn to other enterprises. The impact of this flood of human resources was overwhelming. It produced the greatest social and economic changes in Australia's short history. The sudden influx of free spirits overwhelmed the colony's background as a convict settlement. The great Victorian gold rush was at first based on the recovery of alluvial gold from streams and dry riverbeds. All that was soon gone, and the diggers had to start following the gold into the earth. Harder gravels and quartz were crushed by the Chilean mill. This was brought to Australia from South America through California. It's a direct descendant of the medieval mills used in Spain and Portugal for extracting oil from olives. Eventually, the shallow mines gave out. There came a time when the veins of gold had to be sought deeper in the earth, far beyond the reach of fossickers with picks and shovels. Now there was a need for skilled underground miners and engineers. This is some of the most famous architecture in all mining. These chimneys and engine houses are in South Australia. They bear the stamp of a remarkable English clan, the Cornish miners, known on 4 continents as Cousin Jacks. In the 1840s, a decade before the gold rushes in the east, amazingly rich copper lodes had been found in South Australia and almost simultaneously near the Great Lakes in America. The resulting glut of copper, when shipped to Europe, virtually wiped out the centuries-old copper mines in Cornwall. And the Cornishmen, among the most accomplished hard rock miners in the world, had to leave their homeland and go where their skills were needed.
By the 1840s and 50s, the great migrations from Cornwall were at their height. On the other side of the world, from the Mystic Cliffs in England, there were thousands of Cornishmen here in South Australia, where it was said that at the bottom of every hole, a Cornish miner could be found digging and searching for metal. The mines at Burra here became part of what was known as Little Cornwall. They were scattered all over the New World, And thousands of miles from home, they turned out to be a human resource in waiting for one of those opportunities in history. In Australia, they formed large and competent clans of skilled workers in what became a nation of skilled workers, and which was made a nation, as much as anything else, by a single event, for the exploitation of which their skills and their knowledge proved indispensable.
In Victoria, on the goldfields, the Cornish miners and their managers, known as captains, showed the way to deeper wealth. They sank shafts of 2, 3, even 5,000 feet, and drove uncounted miles of tunnels through the rich reefs of quartz. Their methods produced more than half the entire mineral wealth from Australia in the 19th century.
The gold rushes, which began in California, which vaulted the Pacific to land here, and which eventually extended to New Zealand, to South Africa, and the Klondike, brought new settlers, new ideas, new vigor, and above all, new wealth. Without the enormous supplies of gold they produced, the commerce of the modern world could not have been financed or reach the unprecedented proportions it did. And had it not been for the gold rushes, Australia might very likely have stayed what it had been in the beginning, a convict settlement, a place of exile and of banishment.
The industrialization of the ancient arts of mining meant new dimensions altogether of capital and equipment. Even the most skilled manpower was no longer enough. There had to be machines to pump water out of the deeper shafts, to haul up the ore, and to crush the huge tonnages of rock. A call went out from mines in all parts of the world. It was answered by England. There, the Industrial Revolution was about to take up the burdens which had been borne throughout history by men and by muscle.
I'm Robert Raymond, and I'm the producer of this series. The gold work from Peru and Colombia that you've seen in this episode is an imperishable tribute to the metal workers of South America. But gold is a native metal. It occurs in nature in its pure metallic state and can be worked without further treatment. What intrigues modern metallurgists is that the people of South America had discovered for themselves, long before they had any contact with the Europeans, the technology of smelting metals. Copper objects dating back thousands of years have been found in various parts of the Americas, but no one had ever located the furnaces in which the copper was made until recently. Now, as the result of a series of excavations at Batang Grande on the north coast of Peru, directed by Dr. Izumi Shimada of the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology here at Harvard University, we have the first material evidence for the independent discovery of metal smelting in the Americas. Stephen Epstein was a member of that expedition to Peru.
Right, this is what one of these furnaces looked like if you were to cut it vertically down the middle. And in fact, that's the way it looked when we first saw it, because the looter had dug right through it. The way it worked was really simple. They would fill up the cavity with charcoal and copper oxide ore, represented by the green powder. Then they would stoke it by blowing through blowpipes made of cane with a ceramic tip to protect it from the heat. The temperatures that you could get by just blowing rather than by using bellows, which they didn't have, limited the efficiency of this operation considerably. The product would not be a nice clean copper ingot settled to the bottom. Instead, the ore would separate, metal would be produced all right, but the slag, the melted residue around the ore would never become so liquid that the beads of copper could settle through it and coalesce at the bottom. What you would get at the end of the process is like a fruitcake, a mass of stuff with these little raisins of metal stuck in it. What I had thought was just black dirt or sand or perhaps stained with bits of charcoal was in fact finely ground slag. These people were not just bashing up the lumps of slag to get the beads of copper out. They were actually grinding it to the consistency of sand and then picking out the good bits and then just discarding the rest, and it looks just like dirt.
Well, what's given you the most satisfaction about this?
Well, it's the fact that this is the first time anyone has identified a metal smelting installation in the entire New World. Others undoubtedly existed, and a lot of earlier ones must have existed, but this is the first one anybody's found.
In the whole of the North and South Americas?
In the entire Western Hemisphere.
Dr. Shimada has no doubt about the significance of these finds.
Well, the technology that we have reconstructed compares favorably in some respect with, for example, Near Eastern metallurgy, but in the other respect, we must say it is a rather primitive one. For example, Spanish chroniclers of 16th century tells us that the New World metallurgists did not know of bellow, and that the crucial draft for smelting came through the blow tube. That is to say, we're speaking of lung power, human lung power, as a major force. So this is one of the major difference with, for example, Near Eastern metallurgy.
Even though it may be a primitive way of smelting, it clearly shows that the South American Indians did invent smelting independently from the rest of the world, would you say?
Yes, I think there's no doubt. We are speaking of independent metallurgical tradition, and our fieldwork goes a long way to effectively verify this claim that has long been made, notably by Professor Heather Lechtman of MIT, that we are dealing in the Central Andes, independent and, in fact, notable metallurgical tradition.
Are you expecting to find similar evidence at some stage in North America?
At this point, I am not aware of any archaeological evidence that there were independent metallurgical tradition, let's say smelting, I'm talking about, of copper, etc., in North America. I suspect, as many have done before us, that most sophisticated metallurgy developed in the Andean region of South America, and very likely innovations, ideas, etc., travel or diffused northward.
That is against the movement of the human population, as far as you know.
Yes, that is the case.
Well, why was it then, do you think, that metallurgy appears to have originated in South America and not in North America?
I think there is both cultural and natural reasons or factors. One is that we have the earliest dated ceramic tradition in the New World in the northwestern portion of South America. So we must consider the complementary relationship between ceramic tradition and metallurgical tradition. And another important factor to consider is the presence of needed minerals in the Andean region of South America.
But what is the significance of the ceramic complementarity, as you put it?
Well, in both metallurgy and ceramic production, we are talking about the control of fire or control of heat and production of valuable items out of often invaluable unknown objects. And this manipulation of, in one case, clay, in another case, ore, to produce valuable artifact, I think there's clearly conceptual as well as physical relationship.
Out of the Fiery Furnace is brought to you by a company that makes aluminum for transportation, construction, and manufacturers of consumer products all around your house. Commonwealth Aluminum.
The companion book, Out of the Fiery Furnace by Robert Raymond, is published by the Penn State Press and is available at bookstores throughout the country.